And we are delighted tonight to have Jack Neely and Paul James from the Knoxville History Project to tell us about their latest project in South Knoxville. You know, South Knoxville is sort of the bedroom community to SEYMOUR. But I know a lot of us shop in South Knoxville. We go out to eat, we go to church. Some people go to school in South Knoxville. So we are really connected there. And a lot of our families, the first families of the SEYMOUR, Boyds Creek area, are also connected to the South Knoxville families. So we are going to learn a lot more about that. But before I introduce them, I want to tell you that the restrooms are right down that hall. And the book that many of you have been waiting for, that we've been writing for the last 3.5 years, will soon be in our hands, and we can pass it on to you. If you want to pre-order the book, be sure you get first copies. It's $25, and you'll be able to either pick it up here or have it mailed, and you can place a pre-order at the table back there. All $25 will go to the library, because we're very fortunate that 3 families in our community have underwritten the publishing cost, and we have all worked as volunteers. So this is a fundraising project for the library, and the library will get it all. So now I am delighted to introduce Jack Neely and Paul James to tell us about South Knoxville.
Hey everybody, I'm Paul, that's Jack, okay? Jack's a local, I'm not, as you may tell. But my name is Paul James, I'm the Director of Publishing and Development of the Knoxville History Project. Been with HP, as we call it, for 6 years. Jack started the organisation back in 2016, or 14 actually, 14. So we've been happy with it, and we just want to start off tonight by telling you a little bit about what the Knoxville History Project does. And I'm going to do the first half and then hand it over to Jack. So our mission is pretty simple. We research, preserve and promote the history and culture of the city of Knoxville, Tennessee. And I want to thank tonight some of our funders, because I applaud the fact that you've done this history book on SEYMOUR and you've got it underwritten. That's what we have to do for the work that we do. And we did get a grant through the City of Knoxville, the Arts and Culture Alliance, through the Federal Treasury Department to help underwrite the book that we're doing on South Knoxville. Also, Phil Lawson and the Elson Foundation have been generous as well. So I want to thank them. I also want to talk about a few things that we have done lately. We put together this printed 32-page, free copy of Knoxville, a walking literary guide. We have a few copies in the back. If you haven't seen it, you can see it online as well. Something that Jack's wanted to do for really many years. It's a way to get people to understand and read a little bit about, be introduced to Knoxville writers who are either born here or wrote pivotal works here, from other places, and what their connections are to Knoxville. And these authors might be recognizable to the general American public. So as you can see, James Agee, we have Cormac McCarthy, Francis Hodgson Burnett, and probably about a dozen others as well. So if you'd like a copy of that in the back, I can have it anyway. And also, I want to highlight our downtown art wraps project. How many people have seen these art wraps driving downtown? A few of you. This is using silver blank traffic signal boxes. Everywhere there's a traffic light, you have to have one of these units on the corner. And an idea was presented to us about 6 years ago to wrap these, and they wanted it in a colourful way. So it was actually Jack's idea to use paintings from Knoxville artists from the past. So we've actually done 36 of these. We've just got a couple funded today as well, so that will take it to 38. So many of these paintings from the Knoxville Museum of Art or the McClung Collection, the East Tennessee Historical Society, or the McClung Museum on campus, and a few others at the Beck Cultural Exchange Center. This is one of the latest ones we did. This is The Rabbi Saw Red by Ted Burnett, and this is actually across the street from the KHB office Summit Hill and Walnut, actually. So we've got a few brochures of the downtown art wraps if you'd like to learn more about the program and also where you can see the original works of art. We have a pretty comprehensive website that we're constantly adding to. Go to knoxvillehistoryproject.org. We've got hundreds of stories that Jack has written. We have the literary guide online. We have all the art wrap stuff. We have our podcasts, or you can either find they're now actually on a national platform. If you've got an iPhone or a smartphone, which pretty much everyone in the room has one now, you can download through your podcast app on your phone. And we have 2 seasons of about 20 stories. Many of them Jack has written. I wrote one, and we've had about 1,500 downloads in the last 2 or 3 months, which I'm pretty pleased about. Also, we've done a few driving tours as well, including one on South Knoxville, North Knoxville, East, West. What else have we done, Jack? We did one on walking tour of Fort Sanders not too long ago, the UT campus, driving tour of Fountain City, and the last one we did was on Knoxville and Lonsdale. So if you're interested in doing a driving tour, it's not something you listen to in the car, and you can either print it off as a PDF or you can download it on a tablet or a phone. It's best if you do it with at least 2 people, so you're not driving around and trying to run into something where you're trying to read the tour. But, we've been pretty pleased about that. We started off doing them during the pandemic. And we also do a Zoom series as well on every 3rd Thursday of the month if you're interested in joining us or watching many recorded versions online, like you do here. We did 57 weeks back to back during the pandemic, and we're still going every month. So this month, because it's the 3rd Thursday, 2 days from now, we're actually going to be doing it live from Central Cinema on Central Avenue, just outside of Knoxville. It's part of the Clarence Grand Film Festival, which starts actually tomorrow night, goes through Sunday, and there's great talks and symposium and great free films you can watch throughout downtown and UT. But we're doing it, it's going to be on Zoom, but it's also going to be in person at Central Cinema on Thursday. But transition now to talk about South Knoxville, and the South Knoxville book, the history of South Knoxville, is going to be the 3rd in this series. The first one we did in 2018 was Historic Knoxville, the Curious Visitor's Guide. It's a 200-page full-color history of the city. It's got all the downtown museums, historic collections. It has a history of UT campus, cemeteries, historic neighborhoods, everything crammed into 200 pages, and it's kind of been a local bestseller for us. We're thankful that we've sold about 7,000 copies since 2018. And the follow-up, which came out just as the pandemic hit, is Historic Beard. And again, 200 pages, full color. You can probably, I don't know how many Beardens you can fit in South Knoxville, because obviously the scope is very, very different, but it's amazing the history that is hidden in Bearden. Some of it you can still see, of course, but most people will just drive along Kingston Pike in that West Knoxville community and don't realise what has been there before. Because you can say that about many communities, but particularly Bearden is intensely fascinating. So I wanted to start off with just kind of framing what we are saying the boundaries are for South Knoxville. If anyone has any ideas of challenging that, I'd be glad to take some Q&A at the end. But I'm just going to show a few sections of this map of Knox County from 1895. It's a wonderful map. This is showing District 14, which is just south of the Tennessee River. So our idea of South Knoxville, what we believe it is everything south all the way down to the county line with Buck County. So if we go to District 13, using the perimeter of the Tennessee River, this is West Knoxville over here, Lions View over here, and all the way down into District 21, all the way down to Tarleton Valley. I'm sure everyone in this room knows where Tarleton Valley is, right? You do. Because whenever I say Tarleton Valley in Knoxville, most people's like, where's that? Never heard of it. And of course, if you live in Farragut, you probably never heard of it and never even thought about going there. But it's a pretty fascinating place, and I've been around there much more than Jack has today, because I've been doing a lot of the lead research for one of our grants. But we are going to get into Klondike School, Tarleton Valley. Jack's going to talk a little bit about Newton Springs and working with some volunteers to understand where the old schools were and sort of the landmarks are around town. And of course, for your benefit, the eastern part of South Knoxville is probably, to be honest, is the area that we know the least right now. You know, this is at least a 2-year project, and we haven't really delved into this area yet. So again, if anyone has any information that you'd like to share with Jack and I at the end, I know for a fact I'll mention Shucks Gap, I guess just down the road, maybe a mile, is it 2 miles? I know we're in, obviously we're in Sevier County, and so where does South Knoxville, you know, is there a firm boundary? You know? Like we found with theatre, a lot of people had different ideas of what theatre was. So sometimes there's a formal official version, but people claim it because they live on the fringe or they live just a few blocks away or a few streets. I'm sure that's the case with South Knoxville too. So I just want to highlight a few things that I've been researching, and then I'm going to hand it over to Jack, like I say. But I'm going to start off talking about the Tennessee River and the Tennessee River Bridge and the Gate Street Bridge. I'm sure everyone has been over it. But of course, you know, Knoxville was founded in 1791. It was founded by James White, a Revolutionary War captain that came down here originally from North Carolina and settled along First Creek. You can go to James White Fort today downtown, which is a you know, speculative rendition of what the fort used to look like, with the original cabin still part of it. But you know, it was just up First Creek. So when Knoxville was founded, what we think of South Knoxville today is across the river. You know, most people couldn't cross the river at that point. But one of the early settlers was a fellow called Paul Cunningham. We believe, was a friend. He grew up with James White in North Carolina. And when the early settlers, along with James White, or in the wake of James White, came in the late 1780s, he bought 640 acres from Captain Baker, who had already owned property until very recently across the river. And it was Paul Cunningham's brother, Alexander, who was the very first ferryman. So if you are on the south side of Gate Street Bridge, looking just down onto that flat spot where Holston Gases are, most people understand where I'm talking about. That's where the south end of the ferry was, and it would go across the river to basically very close to you know, the mouth of First Creek. And also James White also ran a ferry from the other side at some point as well. But as far as we know, Alexander Cunningham and the early settlers, the early South Knoxville settlers, operated that very first ferry. The first bridge didn't go until 1864, when the Union troops came into Knoxville and set up the pontoon bridge, which you can see here on the map, and also a photograph of it probably just after the Civil War. Of course, back in the day, there wasn't always a bridge there. In 1867, the Great Freshet, a massive storm, took a lot of buildings, and it caused an amazing amount of damage in Knoxville. And the bridge, that pontoon bridge, was washed away. But it wasn't until 1875 that the second bridge was also destroyed. Actually, it was put in, as you can see here, in 1873. So it only lasted 2 years, and then that bridge got washed away or blew away by a tornado. The third bridge, I'm calling this one the Southport Bridge. Has anyone heard that name? Jack and I did this talk in Woodlawn Pike a few months ago, and some guy came up to us and he kept saying about this Southport Bridge, and we didn't know what he was talking about. But it's named after George Southport, who was owned the company that won the bid to build what essentially is the third Gate Street Bridge. And it was hilarious to me, actually, just last week when I was walking along Gate Street. If you walk along like the 300 block of Gate Street from Summit Hill towards Market Square, there was a lot of names in the bricks. I think it was a fundraiser at some point. I saw the Southport as one of the names on the bricks. Have you ever seen that, Jack? It's curious. So it's someone I think we'd like to find a little bit more about. But he built the third South Knoxville Bridge. And of course, the fourth one went in 1878, and that's the one that you can drive or run or walk or whatever you want to do across the river today. And this is photographed. It was around about 1910. We're able to put a reasonable, accurate date on this because there's a billboard sign on the far right. If you have it on the computer, you can zoom in, and that is for Control Park, which was a fairly small city park that was put in as part of the unification movement, which is kind of where the Baptist Hospital site is today. So it's just great photographs. And of course, back in those early days, talking about Paul Conningham and James White, the people on the south side of the river for a time called it Iredell. Have you ever heard of that? Where that name comes from, that is the home place of where James White was born in North Carolina. So it seemed that that name came with some of those early settlers and was kind of used in this area just for a brief while. You don't see many instances of it being cited. But of course, a more general name for across the river that a lot of people used for a long, long time was South American. That's what they called it. That's what they called it. So I guess they were South Americans, right? And I've even seen it referring to Knoxville across the river as North America as well. And here it is today. This photograph was just taken a few weeks ago. And I love looking at this from the angle of Overblood Mansion, which was one of our earliest remnant houses from 1792 from Government Lot. But one of the first places that was developed in South Knoxville, of course, the settlers developed farms, came into Knoxville proper by ferry or by boat, and later by bridge to trade things or to work. Was the first thing that was developed really was essentially what was initially Colonel Williams Island State, and then later developed by Colonel Perez Dickinson, who was a wealthy business merchant or merchant prince from Massachusetts. One of his cousins was the poet Emily Dickinson, and he had this vision to create what was a very expansive, about 400, 500 acres estate. He never stayed there. He preferred to live in his mansion on Main Street downtown. And it was just an amazing place to go. And the central original house is still there today. And the superintendent of the Tennessee School for the Deaf, which moved there in the early 1920s, typically resides, or has done in the past, resides in that old house. But it was also, I'd say it's an expansive estate. So if you look down here at this gate, that's pretty much where we believe the gatehouse is for Tennessee School of the Deaf. If you're familiar with this area, leading up to it, of course, is the Island Hill Boulevard. And it's almost impossible to imagine what that is today, from looking at these photographs. But after Perez Dickinson passed away, his family sold the estate, and it was until about 1910, 1912, that the Island Home Park, which was the company that developed the houses in Island Home, kind of got started. And of course, it was fueled by this amazing thing called the streetcar track. You could now come across this a much sturdier bridge on a streetcar within a few years and take the streetcar to your house in Island Home and parts of South Knoxville. But there was also a working farm there, and of course a lot of the people that worked there probably lived around. If you drive along Island Home Avenue, we'll get into that in a little second, but these are just wonderful photographs that you can see on the McClung Historical Collection as part of the Knox County Public Library online. Just amazing photographs. But right next to there, I'm sure many of you have heard of the Ijams name. Harry Ijams, his father was the major superintendent of the Tennessee School for the Deaf when he was downtown. It's just kind of ironic that he moved to South Knoxville, and one of his youngest son actually bought property right next to it. But also when Harry and Alice Ijams purchased their property next to what it was part of the Island Home estate. And on their honeymoon in 1905, they came explore their honeymoon in Smokies, and they rode a horse and buggy all the way to Shook's Gap, and then managed to just through here. So 120 years ago, they came through here as a young couple. But it's interesting that they actually chose to also develop kind of the other side of Island Home. But in 1922, Harry Ijams, who was a commercial artist and a strong naturalist by this point, he was very involved with what was known as the East Tennessee Audubon Society. And they developed as a club this bird lodge called the Magnolia Woodward Lodge, right on the edge of the Tennessee River. And it was part of this larger East Tennessee bird preservation. And the new settler was Sunday Journal here, and I called it the City of Birds because there was just an amazing bird life and variety of birds. And right in the heart of it was this kind of semi-private wildlife sanctuary kind of ran by and lived in by the Ijams family. And this is a sketch from one of the local newspapers, and you can see here part we were just talking about, and bird preservation is right in the middle. And what's really cool about this, though, is that today we have Knoxville's urban wilderness. Are you familiar with Knoxville's urban wilderness? How many acres is it now? Several hundred acres. Well, back in the early 1920s, the East Tennessee Audubon Society created what was like a loose East Tennessee bird preservation, which is about 1,000 acres in South Knoxville. Ultimately, it wasn't all sustainable, but the way it was protected, the members of the society, they would post their grounds as being protected habitat. This is very forward thinking really when you think about it. And particularly, as we'll see later on the far right, you've got this very, very quaint, quiet place for a bird sanctuary. What's next door? You've got industrial marble quarrying. Just like chalk and cheese, isn't it? It's just black and white. It's incredible. But it was still able to coexist together for at least a decade anyway. But a lot of people came to the Ijams family bird sanctuary. There's a whole bunch of people here that I don't have time to get into tonight, but it really was a place to come and to be, not only for birding, but also to see wildflowers. And today, in the Ijams Nature Center, which was originally 25 acres when the Ijams family lived there, now over 100 years later, is over 300 itself, including the quarries, and as part of the wider urban wilderness. It's just an amazing success story. And in a way, it's kind of come back full circle after 120 years. But one of the people that Harry Ijams certainly knew was Colonel David Chapman. Chapman Highway, named after him in the 30s to recognize his Herculean efforts to spearhead this notion, let's have a national park in our own backyard, that nobody, in 1910 or 1905 was going. Very few people other than the Ijams, Sir and Mrs. Ijams, or some professors of geology or what have you from UT. Most people weren't going there, and if they were, certainly by 1900, they were probably going there to cut down trees as lumber men. But Colonel Chapman seized upon this idea by Annie Davis, after coming back from a trip out west to Yosemite. Why can't we have a national park in our own backyard? So in December this year, December the 23rd, in fact, it will be 100 years from that idea to create a national park in the Smokies by Knoxvillians was kind of agreed upon and became official. And established the Great Smoky Mountains Conservation Association. So we're going to be telling that story in greater detail later in the year. But it is a big part of South Knoxville because Colonel Chapman lived in the Lakemore Hills, Timberlake area. And his Herculean effort, by the way, is helping to put together 6,600 different property parcel acquisitions. It wasn't just set aside by the federal government. It had to fight tooth and nail to acquire a lot of all these parcels. Some came easy, some came ferociously difficult. But it was really the tenacious nature of Colonel Chapman as a veteran and a civic booster more than anyone else in the early part of the 1900s that made it happen. He was a South Knoxville resident. I'm throwing this one here. This is a photograph of the Ijams family in the middle right here on the first official visit to Mount Cont. There's a fellow on the right with the axe, which is Paul Adams, who's also a big friend of the Ijams family. You may have heard of Smoky Jack or Cumberland Jack. He had this dog that had the saddlebags fashioned for him, and he built the first campsite on Mount Cont, and this is the first group of Knoxvillians visiting that, including this fellow here, which is Rockaway Crouch as well. There's also, as you see on the right, he later in his life lived in the Timberlake area near General Franklin Maloney. All these were members of the Conservation Association who were heavily involved in the nomenclature committees for the Smokies. General Mahoney, his role with the Conservation Association was to get funding for and make the Foothills Parkway happen, which we enjoy today. So Rockaway Crouch, being a local florist and a naturalist, was also was an early trailblazer as well, so again, was very involved in the planning of the park. So that's just 3 guys plus the Ijams in South Knoxville, and maybe we'll find other people as well. So the smokies is a big deal. I want to kind of end my little bit on the quarries. You know, we looked at those maps that how this Ijams are building this nature preserve. Right next are these very noisy quarries. And it is amazing today that they are part of Ijams. And I guess I can claim my part in that because I was the director at Ijams for 12 years, from 04 to 2016. We were able to develop Meats Quarry and led later our Ross Marble Quarry. And this is, we're looking at Ross Marble. Anyone been to the Keyhole? Anyone know what the Keyhole is? I know Lena hasn't. Just an amazing place in Knoxville that you can have a lunch on Market Square and within 15, 20 minutes, park at Ijams, walk maybe half a mile. And when I interviewed Jack for Metropods years ago, you know, we talked about this bit like being Skull Island, didn't we? That King Kong could come around the corner because it's like this overgrown wilderness. But this is what it was 100 years ago, and it's just amazing. And this is kind of, well, this is what it was in the 1920s, but on the right, where they were excavating the Tennessee marble, which is obviously a big natural resource, that part of Knoxville's growth, that's where the lake is right now. You know, at some point, they hit the water table, had to pump the water out, and then when the operations, the limestone operations, kind of went dead in the late 1960s, early 70s, took the pipes out, and then the water came naturally back, and that's what you can see in Meats Quarry today. So it's amazing that this landscape is a big deal. It's a big deal for South Knoxville. So I'm going to hand it over to Jack now, and he's going to take on the story with Cal Johnson.
There's so much to South Knoxville. It's everything we take on, almost every subject, whether it's Bearden or UT or whatever. It's the history of Western civilization, basically, in one place, and that's the same is true of South Knoxville. But this is a fascinating place. If you notice that place with the oval circle, blue circle around it, you might think that looks like it's about where Suttree Landing Park is. A lot of you have been to Suttree Landing, I suppose. It's a fairly new city park, but it's actually an old public place because it was back in 1880. It was Cal Johnson's first racetrack. Cal Johnson was an astonishing fellow because he was a guy who was raised in slavery. And as a teenager, he, through several circumstances, one was that he took a job for the federal government reburying Civil War corpses. He would go to battlefields where Union bodies had been buried a foot or two beneath the surface, and brought them back to Knoxville to the National Cemetery for $7 per corpse. And that's he made money that way. As a teenager driving a mule cart up to Cumberland Gap and elsewhere to do this, but he made a little money and actually investing with his mother. Interestingly, his mother was interested in real estate, and they began playing with businesses and real estate and so forth. But Cal Johnson grew up around horses, and he loved horses more than anything else. So he had a series of racetracks around town, and this was the first one. The first Cal Johnson racetrack was on leased land on the south side of the river, right on the riverfront. Half-mile oval racetrack that was there in the 1880s. So if you see a reference to Cal Johnson's racetrack in the 1880s, it's in South Knoxville. It's a fascinating story. Later on, you may know that Cal Johnson actually purchased land in East Knoxville, and to this day, there's a place called Speedway Circle, and it's a half-mile oval, but it's paved and has houses on it. It was actually originally a horse racing track, later on an automobile racing track. Cal Johnson also landed the first airplane ever seen in East Tennessee in 1910 on the same track. But his very first one was here in South Knoxville. And this is a rare picture I'd never seen before a few days ago. But this is a picture of a racetrack in use that Paul found in 1910. It was actually used by the university for some reason. I can't quite tell those are little wagons or something.
Sulkies.
You all know a word I don't know. What are they called? Harness racing. Okay, I've seen harness racing before. I thought that's what it might be. But that's a brand new picture for us, and we're gonna, unless we find some really amazing pictures, we're gonna definitely use this one in the book. But this shows that it was still being used for some years after Cal Johnson had left this, and after most horse racing had ended around 1906, when we banned betting in Tennessee on horse racing. So this was it was still being used, and it was also being used by the University of Tennessee as a track before UT. Remember, UT was originally just up on the hill. They didn't have a track up there. So they would actually go all the way up the river to this place across the river, and they would have track meets over here at the old Cal Johnson track on the south side. So
that could be earlier than that. That's a date that's been given on it.
yeah. Well, that's just a guess, I guess, they might have had a different rule for harness racing, but anyway, they kind of kicked the economic props out of horse racing as soon as we banned betting in Tennessee, and then we started thinking it was just a Kentucky thing after that. But anyway, the next one. And this is, this is the lumber mill, right? Yeah, this is the DM Rose Lumber Mill, which is right on the river. And this lumber and marble were the two really big businesses of South Knoxville. And we talked a little bit about the marble quarries, but lumber was a very big deal, partly because it was the first lumber processing place so close to the mountains, which were at this time open for clear cutting. But DM Rose was a major lumber supplier. One of two. Vestal, of course, was another. But Rose was right on the river. They said there used to be a shanty town down on the riverfront, and it was called Roseville because it was so close to the Rose Lumber Company. But it was where squatters lived. People often ask me, what did we do about homeless a long time ago? Well, we didn't call them homeless. They had homes, but they were little boxes on the river. That's where people lived, and we just called them their homes. But anyway, we're going to get into the whole the story of industry in South Knoxville. But also there's another thing, a brickyard and a slaughterhouse were right along here as well. These are things that we, especially the slaughterhouse, that we had experimental slaughterhouses downtown, and nobody wanted them next door to their businesses, so they ended up being pushed away to South Knoxville and elsewhere. But of course, later on, the East Tennessee Packing Company was on the riverfront, Selecto and all that. I don't know if you remember that. The next one, please. Oh, yes.
Is this that picture you just showed? Is that west of Chapman Highway?
That's east of Chapman Highway. Yeah. That Cedar Avenue area has changed quite a lot over the years. As Paul mentioned, there used to be a park over there, and then there was a hospital where the park is. Now the hospital's gone too. But the question.
I think that's South Knoxville Baptist Church in the very center, and Davenport is the side of running up Real Palm.
We just found Paul's found some great pictures of that I don't think anybody's ever seen before, and one of them is of the original South Knoxville Baptist Church, and we're just looking at those today. But y'all know this area pretty well, so we love it. Yeah, and Davenport's a name, an old family name of several interesting people there. All right, and of course Vestal was named for the Vestal Lumber Company that was there from 1900 until the latter part of the 20th century. It was a major lumber company, even nationally. Steinway pianos were made from Vestal lumber. It was processed right there. And of course, they have the festival every year. Who goes to the festival? We actually sat up there and had a great time this year. It's always the day before Mother's Day, and at the old Pandora Marble building right there, which is right next door to where Vestal, the main factory, was. But the whole industrial history of South Knoxville is part of what makes it fascinating. And speaking of Pandora, this is the building that's still there on the right that is kind of central to Festival. It was a building designed in 1925 by Charlie Barber, a well-known architect of Knoxville, but it's unique, I think, in the world because it's a building made to show off different kinds of Tennessee marble. And it has more than a couple dozen different varieties of Tennessee marble that you can see in use inside the building because they were very proud of what they did. They had a lot of marble cutters who worked there, and interestingly, a lot of them were Italian stone cutters who grew up with the tradition of Michelangelo in Italy. And one of them was actually from Michelangelo's favorite place in Italy, the famous quarry where he worked. But a guy named Albert Milani. He lived in South Knoxville for many years and actually worked for the Vestal Lumber Company. He's probably the best known sculptor of any sort from Knoxville. But he did a lot of interesting work over the years. If you recognize anybody recognize these eagles? People see them every single day on a very popular building downtown. It's the old post office building on Main Street. Has 4 of these big eagles across the top. It's a marble building. It was built by the federal government, but they used local talent to embellish the building with these big eagles. They finished it built it between 1932 and 1934. But that was when Milani was working there. Milani was also the same guy who did the Pete Chris monument. There's a new book about Pete Chris, the Indianapolis Speedway racer from Knoxville, who was killed in a trial in Indianapolis, and the same Milani did this astonishing monument that you can still see in the Asbury Cemetery in Forest River that actually shows the whole brickyard in Indianapolis, and also shows Chris's car going off the rail exactly where it happened. He was a very talented sculptor. He came here in 1912 to work on the Holston building in downtown Knoxville. Thought he would move on, but he ended up spending the rest of his long life here. One of his last sculptures was a sculpture of Billy Majors, Johnny Majors' brother, who was killed in the car train collision in West Knoxville in the 1960s. So Milani was still working into the early 70s. Amazing, another interesting South Knoxville story. This is the story of Missy Thompson and Log Haven. Anybody know what Log Haven is? It's an unusual development that a lot of people don't know about because it's kind of out of the way. If you haven't been there, you've probably never noticed it. It's a little cul-de-sac in the hills up above Vestal, basically over close to the river. Log Haven was it's a collection of log cabins, and it was built by a woman whose husband had left her, and she still had 2 kids to raise. Just an astonishing story of bravery, but she invested everything she had into building a bunch of log cabins in 1930 or 32 or so. And what are you going to do with that? Well, it turned out that these were very popular, and a lot of interesting offbeat people tended to want to rent cabins and live there. The old New Settlement colonist Bert Fensick lived there for several years. I'm trying to think the guy that in charge of WNOX, the Lowell Blanchard, who created the Midday Mirror around in downtown Knoxville, was from Chicago, but he moved here and wanted to live in a log cabin, and he lived there for years. But also a well-known architect named Alfred Klaus and his wife lived there for a while. We're going to talk about him in a minute. But Missy Thompson, this woman with a single mother with 2 kids, just kind of ran the place. It was her place. She built it, and she was the kind of the den mother, the maintenance crew, everything else about the place. ended up not just having the cabins she built, but also moving cabins that were being vacated by TVA projects. When TVA would build the North Dam, there were a lot of leftover cabins and parts of cabins, and Missy Johnson got some of those and put them together and added them to the party up there at Log Haven. She ended up having at the height probably close to 20 cabins, and each was like an odd little community up there in the woods that's only about a mile from downtown Knoxville, so it was interesting. But later on, it tended to attract unusual people, and a couple of the unusual people that it attracted later on were a couple of young guys named Chris Whittle and Phil Moffett, who at the time were building a magazine empire, and they actually were living at Log Haven when they bought Esquire magazine, and actually a lot of the issues of Esquire magazine published in the late 70s and early 80s were planned in the cabins at Log Haven. But a fascinating story. It's been, it was almost torn down. Log Haven, of course, Missy Johnson died many years ago, and a developer from Georgia bought up the area, just wanted to build a lot of giant student housing pods up there, and they already built several. And somehow there was a downturn in the economy that, and at that moment, the Aslan Foundation, the charitable foundation, stepped in and bought Log Haven from this developer, and has saved Log Haven as an artist community. It's kind of a place you can get a scholarship and live for 6 months while you're working on your novel or your painting or whatever. They even have a dance studio there now. But it's a fascinating and I think worthy use of this really unusual creation of this woman in desperate circumstances, like the 1930s, who put this unusual idea together. Yeah, here's another colored picture of one of the Log Haven cabins. And I mentioned, you may know this better. This is just down the street right off of Chapman Highway, right behind Yield Steakhouse. Little Switzerland was an astonishing thing, and I always knew it was up there. I've known people who were in connections with it. It's an extremely, almost futuristically modernist community up there. That was designed by a German architect who came to Knoxville to work for TVA. He was from Munich. He had worked with Mies van der Rohe and many of the other very famous modernist international style architects of Europe and Bauhaus architects of the mid-19th century. But it was interesting how TVA was trying to be extremely progressive and right on the cutting edge of everything they did, to a degree that I think that people have forgotten. But they even had very modern architects working to build Norris Dam and to build the power plants they were building in the 1930s and 40s. And one of them was a guy named Albert Klaus. And they didn't pay him to build what people today think is the first international style modernist housing development in America. Literally, that's what that is. This has actually been written about in the national press in recent months. This thing that we always thought of, this odd little community up there up on the hill, has some international status to it. But these houses they've been modified. Some are in great shape, some have been falling down over the years. But they're being modified by an architect named John Sanders, who actually lives in one of these houses, and has been working on this for some time. And we're working with him to try to interpret the history of this. Because Albert Klaus, it turns out, was an internationally significant figure who was doing work very quietly right here on Chapman Highway back in the late 1930s, doing this stuff that in the 1970s would have seemed shockingly modern. It's gotten the attention. The Wall Street Journal had a story about it fairly recently. It's got a lot of attention just lately. But we're going to be telling the whole story of Little Switzerland as part of this story as well. There's a lot of aspects to it. Right. And another thing, a lot of people may not realize that a guy who lived in a house that's still standing right along Woodlawn Pike is a guy who grew up in Knoxville, the son of the first black postal clerk in Knoxville history. His father worked in the custom house back in the 1880s, I think. But William Macy grew up with the idea of becoming an attorney. He not only became an attorney, but he became the first black federal judge in American history. This guy who grew up here in South Knoxville. And a lot of them don't even know that they're in the story. And we want to be sure that he's part of the story as well. But we're just lucky. We've torn down so many homes of so many famous people in Knoxville history. His house is still there and still occupied. And we want to hope will be remembered forever. Of course, the William Macy Natural Area honors him as part of the Urban Wilderness Greenway system. But a fascinating story. He's also not only the first black federal judge, he was also the first black person to be a governor of a state or territory in America. He was governor of the U.S. Virgin Islands in the 1940s. But again, an interesting figure that we hope to make more familiar with our book. And here's another guy who's actually his birthday is coming up in a few days. He turned 130. Paul Y. Anderson. He's a guy who's kind of been forgotten. We remember some Pulitzer Prize winners like Cormac McCarthy and James Agee. He won the Pulitzer Prize before they did, back in the 1920s. He won the Pulitzer Prize for journalism when he figured out the whole complicated mess that was known as the Teapot Dome scandal, and reported that about the Harding and Coolidge administrations, and reported that in the St. Louis Post-Gazette, and it was the most thorough and accurate description of the whole thing that anybody had ever done before. He also wrote stories exposing the mafia. He covered race riots. He was fearless. He was a tough quarry kid. His dad had been killed in a derrick accident. He grew up just poor and tough in South Knoxville, and began working around 1910 for the old Knoxville Journal and Tribune, when Captain Rule was still in charge of that paper. But went on to national things. Lived a rather short life, but lived in Washington D.C. And this stone that was erected at Island Home Baptist Church, and it stands out from all the other stones there, was a result of a nationwide effort to raise funds for it by a lot of well-known journalists across the nation who admired Paul Y. Anderson, including Haywood Broome, one of the most famous reporters of that era. But we want to remind people that Paul Y. Anderson was a South Knoxvilleian too. We've just recently discovered exactly where he grew up, and again, in this case, and it's not in many cases in Knoxville history, his house is still standing. His childhood home is still standing, and the home where his mother lived later on. He would come back to Knoxville and spend about a month a year, and usually this time of year, in the summer, would come back and he would play golf at Olson Hills Country Club, and mainly he would visit with his mother, who lived over on Phillip Street, near where Sumter Landing Park is now. And that house is still standing as well. But here's the Mount Olive Baptist Church. We're going to be talking about a lot of the history of the Baptist churches in Knoxville. But this one has a few things especially interesting about it. One is that it has the very interesting cemetery associated with it and connected to it. And that cemetery has something we have that nobody else in the world has, which is this monument to the worst naval disaster in U.S. history. This is something, people always said, if it had happened any other time, it would be more famous, but it happened in one of the most dramatic and tragic months in American history, April of 1865. What happened was hundreds of Union soldiers who had been sweltering in Confederate prisons in the Deep South for a couple of years were finally freed. And rather than just getting to go home, they had to go to the Ohio River to be mustered out. So they were marched over to the Mississippi River, boarded a steamship called the Sultana on the Mississippi River, which was meant to hold about 300 or 400 people. And there were a couple thousand of these guys crammed onto this boat. There was a bounty for all these guys, and they were collecting money on it. And the boat started churning up the river, and it made it a few miles, but near Memphis, the boiler exploded. And they don't know exactly what caused it, but the ship went up in flames and sank, and some men were scalded to death, some drowned in the river, some survived. And an astonishing number of these people on the ship, both those who died and those who survived, were from South Knox County. So it just so happens that, that actually some of them were still alive when they established this monument, which is, despite the fact it happened in Memphis, despite the fact that it had men from Ohio and Michigan and other other places who died on it, the biggest monument to the Sultana explosion is in South Knoxville. I understand there's now a museum effort on the Mississippi River near where the ruins of what's left of the Sultana is believed to be underneath silt. They're going to try to build a museum there soon, and they might actually come up with a bigger monument than this. But for right now, this is it. It's a monument, and for a long time I thought it was an Albert Milani monument. It's not, but it's got a nice bas relief of the actual ship on the side of it, and the list of all the men who died on it. So it's not hard to find. I encourage you on a Sunday afternoon to go up there. There's a Sultana descendants organization that gets together once in a while. I was honored to get to go to I think the 150th anniversary of the explosion was a few years ago, and they had hundreds of people came out from all over the country and just to be around this monument. So that's going to be in the book obviously as well. But, okay, here's you might know this better, Newbert Springs. This is you may know that Knoxville was once known, this area extensively was once known for all of its springs resorts. This was before we went to the beach, we went to springs, and if you live 10 miles away from one, you would go out of town for a few weeks and spend at the springs. If you lived 1,000 miles away, you come here for the springs, and whether you believe the waters were medicinal or not, it was just a nice way to spend a summer in a cool place usually, and with water around. One of the earliest ones is not too far from here, Montvale Springs. That was from the 1830s, and if you go there today, that was a Boy Scout camp I went to in the 60s, and there's still the steps of that old hotel that burned down are still there. But Newbert Springs, a lot of these springs still have some remnant of the old springs, and that's the case with Newbert Springs. This later, I think, was established in the late 1800s, but it lasted longer. But a lot of these were going out of business by the early 20th century. Whittle Springs was another, but Newbert Springs was there longer, and it actually lasted into the Jazz Age. And they say in the 1920s, there was a Jazz Age. There was also a Prohibition, but people would go here to hear live jazz from the bandstand, but also to get liquor, and that was a party, and I wrote across several accounts of that in the 1920s. But there's still the little remnant of the gazebo, right, that you can see very clearly. A very unusual gazebo made of like twisted roots and painted white. But that's apparently original. So that's part of what makes South Knoxville different. So many of the remnants of architecture and things like that are what makes this place pretty fascinating. Okay, next I have a bit of a question for you. This is something we're always learning, and I want to hear your thoughts about everything. But a few months ago was working on a project about the history of baseball in Knoxville, and I was mainly about Caswell Park, and I realized that Caswell Park has a whole lot of history. But I was trying to find out, especially in these times, we were trying to find out when were the first integrated baseball teams, and found out what I kept hearing these stories about the summer of 1953, I think it was, when we had a black ball player from elsewhere who was having problems with integration in Arkansas, Mississippi, and he decided to step down to a lower league and play in the Knoxville team for a summer. His name was Jim Tugerson. This was 70 years ago, and you're showing your age if you remember having been at that fall game. But we'd love to talk to you if you have. Jim Tugerson played in Knoxville, and first I thought this is at Caswell Park, and I thought, well, no. It turned out that this was the year that they tore down Old Smithson Stadium at Caswell Park and were building Billy Meyer Stadium. And so that for a whole season, they had to play somewhere else. And they played in a place they called Chapman Highway Park. And I want to find out if there's anybody that knows where Chapman Highway Park was. Here's some pictures of that's Jim Tuber's brother, I think Leander, his name was, who played with him sometimes. But they were both well-known ball players, and they say they just had people, hundreds of people. It was so popular that they were loading buses on Market Square downtown to drive down Chapman Highway to Chapman Highway Park. And it was very close to where we are now. That's all I know for sure, because it was back here.
It was on Chapman Highway, very close to where the Wyoming Motel is now.
Oh,
And there's a bank there.
okay.
I've heard that too, Jack.
Okay.
It's right down here.
Okay, yeah, we'd love to just nail that down for certain, and I appreciate that. Yeah, but that, I think that's, even though it might be outside of what we think of as South Knoxville, I think it's a story we want to tell of this, because this is just an interesting story. But that was just that interesting moment in baseball history. It was kind of our Jackie Robinson moment in East Tennessee. Interestingly, this was almost 15 years before the Tennessee Vols had a black ball player on the football team. So this seems significant. But we want to tell these stories and many others, and would love to hear your ideas about things we talked about. And
What's
things
the
we,
name on there, on the front of their Baser?
yeah, these are. I think they were from Arkansas. Was it Hot Springs Bathers or something like that? Yeah, I think that was the name of their team before they came here. Yeah, and yeah, I hadn't even noticed that until you just mentioned it. But yeah.
What was the Knoxville one?
The Smokies. This is the Knoxville Smokies back then. Yeah. But other questions, comments? Yeah.
Could the location of that field have anything to do with the fact that it's in Sevier County?
That'd be in Blount County.
And wasn't Knoxville drier than Sevier County for a long time? I don't know.
I don't know. I think they're just looking for any field that was close enough to standard to work, and so it was across the county line. I don't know whether it was Sevier or Blount, but if you say it's Blount, I'll believe it. But yeah.
What do you think, Ann?
Other questions or? Back to our question about where does South Knoxville end? Where are the lines? Where you draw the lines? Is it at the county line? Because I don't see a really clear dividing line between Allen Home and near here. So for now our working plan is to go all the way to the county line, or maybe slop over it a little bit now and then. But any ideas about that? We had a whole issue with Bearden because there were some people who had very, very strict and clear ideas of what Bearden was. And I realized after a while that these people were all of a certain age, and they remembered when Bearden was a county school and West was a city school, and this line was right there. And that was, you couldn't call anything. You couldn't call anything east of Carr Street Bearden, even though their grandparents had. We found out.
Depends on who's grandpa.
Yeah, that's right.
When you showed the map with Knoxville and Sevier County, Knox and Sevier County, you're showing that range, the ridges that make Shook's Gap.
Yeah.
I think the gap, the map, the range is what separates, again, it's geological.
The two counties, yeah.
Actually, it follows those from Pike.
Mhm.
And everything, as you come through Shook's Gap, everything on the right is Blount
Uh-huh.
all the way, if you turn there at the traffic light and go up, over the Pike.
Yeah.
Until you get to that street that goes down by the way on the motel and everything, that's Blount County.
Yeah.
And then crosses over, it takes in the restaurant down there where you can balls, all that's in Blount County.
What's the range called you're talking about? Where the cut is?
Yeah.
Offside.
Does it have a name, the ridge there? Does the ridge itself have a name? Is it Shook's Ridge or?
Base Lamp?
Page Mountain.
Maze Mountain. Okay.
Well, an interesting thing that Bob discovered on an old map, that there's a location in South Knoxville called Shooks. There's nowhere near Shooks Gap. It's where Kimberlin Heights and Sevierville Pike cross.
Yeah.
Just a hair south of Knoxville Highway.
Yeah, names are fascinating. If you ever studied the 1895 county map that's on the wall at McClung Collection, because there's a Kangaroo, Tennessee, and there's a Bermuda, and all in Knox County, but also the Klondike School. How did it get its name in deep South Knox County? We want to find out about that, and we suspect a lot of these things were named in the 1890s when there was the Klondike Gold Rush, and that. Yes.
As part of our research for the book, which by the way is called From the Mouth of Boyd's Creek, we looked at a variety of maps, and depending on how old they are, Shooks kind of moved up into Knox County. It was in one place in one map, and then a few years later it was somewhere else.
About that. Well, that's interesting. Yeah, migrating community.
It is a naturally occurring gap, and that's why Chapman knows it.
Yeah. It's fascinating how things don't change over here. Sharp's Gap, you can see, that's the one thing you can see in Civil War photographs that doesn't change. You can see Sharp's Gap looks exactly the way it does today. Yeah. Yes.
My father was a surveyor, so I got involved with quite a bit of the surveying thing. It was confusing. You see a church, is at Burnett Station and Sevierville Road. Their address is Sevierville. It's in Blount County by a mile, but right up here at Burnett Station Road, where it comes into Chapman, there's a point. It's like an angle that comes in with Blount County, Sevier County, and Knox County. And I just saw the signs just recently. It says Sevier County. Somebody has put up now. But you can get very confused. The new people who are moving into the area and the old timers that have been here know these places differently.
Yeah.
But don't go by the postal addresses because they're all wrong.
Yeah, well, SEYMOUR takes in all three counties.
A big story. The Blount County does not have the manpower or stuff for the mail, so Sevier County, the town here takes care of Blount County, and then you've got Knox here coming up, and I don't know how that's addressed now, but it drove me crazy for the longest time until I sat down with a real map and saw the angles coming in, kind of like, almost like a Y.
Yeah.
So,
speaking of Brenda said that there was a road through Shooks before Chapman Highway on what was it called? Of course, yeah.
the train came through there too. Turtle Pike came through there first, and the train came through diagonally, and then Chapman Highway came through the same.
We're going to try to figure out Sevierville Pike. There's a lot of pieces of it still here. But
The Turtle Pike was the key. The old Turtle Pike where it came out from Valley Grove Church there, and then came through Shooks Gap. Everything on the right, this side of Shooks Gap was Blount County, and it followed Old Turtle Pike. You got up there to the electric station, right there on the right, and it goes down that way, and then zigzags a little bit. And it's a little bit, looks a little
Not to
bit.
be confused with Sevierville Road, which if you're coming from Maryville, it's Sevierville Road. If you're going to Maryville, it's Maryville Pike.
Bob, you have something?
I've got some information on Sevierville Pike. I can't think of it real clear right now. I'll get it to you later. The thing I'm curious about is that the stagecoach stop is on Sevierville Pike in the Knox County side there where that Georgian house is, or whatever, the tennis courts that had that land argument across the street. Who knows anything about that?
Between here and Chapel and Valley Road Church.
Is that power? quite about it.
It's on Otis River Pike. It was Charlie Hobbs' house that built all the hills. But I don't know who owned that.
There's a marker there.
It's a marker.
Yeah. We're grateful to Bob Davis, by the way, because he's a wealth of information about a lot of important things and straightens us out about, and he tends to be an expert on things that are very confusing, like railroads and things like that. So we're really grateful to his help.
One part of the paved part of Seville Pike ended in Indians. And they changed it around over the years. It's a mess. Because it's hard to get through South Knoxville by car or by rail. There are all these unnamed ridges. There's Burnett's Ridge, close to Knoxville. Then we got Bays Mountain here with all of these buzzards roost. Buzzard roost.
Yeah, we
Bunch of crazy places.
Yeah, we were talking about that the other day. Other questions or comments? Well, thanks a lot. We'll hang around for a little bit and you can come check with us.
When we were driving in, we looked over and saw the Wayona Motel. How long has that been around?
Since the mid-1950s.
Since the mid-50s. Because one thing you would want to get into is the whole hotels and all
Yeah,
that.
that's part of our story is the whole tourist business that grew up from Knoxville all the way to the Smokies along Chatham Highway.
Are there other examples?
Where the Walmart is now, I stepped out for a minute. Did you talk about that Chapman Motel? It used to be right in front of where the Chapman Drive-In Theater used to be.
Yeah,
Where the Walmart is now?
Yeah.
I know about that.
There used to be a man named U.U. Cobble that had a record service right there.
You Cobble?
U.U. Cobble. And he had a picture in front of his place that had Chapman Highway when it was dirt, when it was big. I remember that when I was a kid.
Yeah, okay, we'll keep an eye on that.
What was the motel called?
I think it was a Chapman Highway Motel. It was little, but it was weird. It was like little houses all around in a circle.
Yeah, that was what we found in Bearden. That was the motels actually evolved from the old motor court thing when there were individual houses, and that kind of was, I guess, simplified into a motel plan. But that was very popular in the 20s. Those motor courts. Yeah.
Have you all noted that before the interstate, Chapman Highway, and unfortunately, I can remember this. Chapman Highway used to be buffered to buffer.
It was the nation's main way to get to the Smoky Mountains. It's the most popular national park in America. Yeah, that's right.
It was a commitment of hours to go to the mountains.
Wow. Yeah.
And then the interstate came through and killed it, just like that. Which people who lived on it were delighted, and then it started building residential. And then.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's part of the story.
Martinsville Pike is also a road to get from Knoxville to
Martinsville in Blount County, right? Yeah. We want to find out about Martin and all that stuff too. All right, well, thanks a lot, Joel. Appreciate it.
I want to put another plug in for From the Mouth of Boyd's Creek, because Anna has written some great stories about the victims and survivors of the Sultana. So many of the descendants of this community were involved in that. Bob Davis has also been a great help to Steve Petty in all the sections that have to do with transportation, the steamboats, the roads, the trains. You're going to have to get a copy of our book. I think it's going to help you. I also want to tell you that 2 months from tonight, Anna and I will be speaking on the Civil War in the Boyd's Creek Valley. So we hope we'll have a big turnout then from the research we have done, which also leads over into Knox County. So we appreciate your coming tonight and hope we'll see you again at our programs.